Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of Acts chapter 1 and the prediction that Christ would come, quote, in like manner. The traditional argument on Acts chapter 1, 9 to 11, goes something like this. Well, the disciples were gathered with Jesus on the Mount. Jesus ascended in the physical, fleshly body of a 5'5" Jewish man. The disciples, as they gazed up into heaven, were astounded, obviously. But an angel said, "You men of Galilee, why do you gaze up in the heavens? This same Jesus who is taken from you will come in like manner as you have seen him go." Well, since Jesus ascended in the 5'5" physical body of a Jewish man, he must come again at the end of time in the body of a 5'5" Jewish man. Well, this is lesson number 4 in our somewhat in-depth examination of Acts chapter 1, demonstrating that that is an absolutely untenable and unbiblical doctrine. Now, it's very, very important that you have watched the previous installment of our series on the bridegroom. It's helpful to have watched the segment on the absent master as well. But our real focus in this segment is part 2 of our examination of the coming of Christ in Acts chapter 1 as the coming of the bridegroom for his wedding. Now, it's very critical to understand, I don't know of anyone, really, honestly, that denies that the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 1 is the coming of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25, 1 through 13. In other words, as you go through the commentaries, commentary after commentary after commentary says Matthew chapter 25 is the second coming of Christ. Acts chapter 1 is the second coming of Christ. The coming of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25 is the coming of Christ for the wedding. Therefore, Acts chapter 1 is the time of the coming of Christ for the wedding. Now, by way of review and to set the stage for what we want to see in this installment, we need to be reminded of some absolutely critical foundational texts. We cannot approach Acts chapter 1 in isolation from the rest of the Bible doctrine of the wedding. In our previous installment about the wedding, we took note of the fact that the wedding was an Old Covenant promise made to Old Covenant Israel. So by way of review, let's take note of certain facts. Number 1, God was married to Israel. Jeremiah 31, 29 and following, Yahweh reminded Israel how he had made the marriage covenant with them when he took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt and made his covenant with them. In Isaiah 51 through 54, Yahweh said to Israel, "I am your husband, you are my wife." So there's no question whatsoever that under the Old Testament, Yahweh was betrothed to Israel. Point number 2, Israel, and specifically the 10 northern tribes, committed spiritual adultery against Yahweh. She became an unfaithful harlot bride. Consequently, in Hosea chapter 2, 1 through 2, Yahweh issued a divorce decree against her, saying, "I am not your husband, you are not my bride." It is critical to understand and to remember that when Yahweh divorced Israel, number 1, he divorced her. Number 2, he departed from her, Hosea 5:15 and following, and he brought death on her. Not biological death, but alienation from him, covenant death, by being separated from his presence. And yet, point number 3, Yahweh promised that in the last days he would remarry Israel by making a new covenant with her, Hosea chapter 2:18, Jeremiah 31. Once again, the days are coming, says the Lord, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. that covenant would not be like the old covenant. And remember that when Yahweh divorced Israel, the 10 northern tribes, He destroyed the kingdom, the geocentric, military, social, economic kingdom, the old covenant form of the 10 northern tribes. And He said she would never rise again. Amos 5, 1 and 2. But remember, Yahweh could not divorce Judah because Messiah had not yet come. And in spite of that, Yahweh said that in the last days, when He would regather the remnant, as He promised in Amos 5, that Judah would have the same harvest that the 10 tribes had. Remember, the harvest of the 10 tribes was national kingdom destruction. So Judah would have her harvest in the last days when Yahweh saved the remnant. And it would be in that last days period in which, when He divorced Judah, having now divorced all 12 tribes from that old covenant form, destroyed the old covenant kingdom, Yahweh could then make the new marriage covenant with the righteous remnant of all 12 tribes and invite all men to come into the blessings of the new covenant. Folks, that's what Acts 1 is about. What we see on the pages of the New Testament is the prediction of the imminent divorcement of Judah, the imminent departure of Yahweh from the old covenant form, and the imminent death of old covenant Judah. Remember, the 10 northern tribes had already experienced divorce, departure, and death. But throughout the pages of the New Testament, we find this concept that now Judah was about to receive her harvest, just like Hosea 6, 9 to 11 foretold. So let's develop that concept just a little bit and see how we can correlate the concept of the impending divorcement of Judah with the coming of the Lord that was about to take place. The coming of the Lord, not only in judgment, destruction, divorce, and death of Judah, but the time of the coming of Jesus, the bridegroom, for His wedding. Let's look first of all at the predictions of the destruction, that is, the divorce, the destruction, and the death of Judah. Notice in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus told a parable, and He said, "A great man made a great wedding feast for his son. He sent out his servants to call those who had been invited." Now ask yourself the question at this point. Here is Jesus, who is a good, faithful Jew, raised under Torah. He knows the Old Testament scriptures. Whose promise was the wedding? To whom had Yahweh made the promise of the great wedding banquet? Well, it was Israel. To whom had Yahweh made the promise that He would make a new covenant with both houses of Israel? Jeremiah 31. It was Old Covenant Israel. Now remember, because boy, this is important. In Jeremiah 31, He promised to make a new covenant with both houses of Israel. He had cut the 10 northern tribes off from the house of David, destroyed the nationalistic kingdom, but He promised He'd make a new covenant with them. But He would cut off the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, destroying their nationalistic geopolitical kingdom in order to make a new creation, a new bride. But you see, the promise of a new covenant meant the old covenant had to be done away with. The 10 northern tribes had already been cut off from that kingdom and from that covenant. So the promise of a new covenant demanded that in the last days, in the days of the making of the new covenant, guess what? Judah and Benjamin had to be destroyed. That covenant had to be annulled. That old covenant marriage covenant had to be annulled. So back to Matthew chapter 22. The master sent out his servants to call those who had been invited. Those who had been invited were Old Covenant Israel. Now Israel's being invited to the wedding. But they begin to mistreat those servants who were sent to them. They despise them. They begin to make excuses. They beat those servants. They killed those servants. Now what happened? The master of the feast, of the wedding, was angry, sent out his army, killed those wicked men, watch this, and burned their city. What city is this? This is Judah. Here is the divorcement, the destruction, and the death of Judah, who has become the unfaithful harlot bride. Now remember, as we suggested in our previous segment, the term harlot in the New Testament. And by the way, what did Jesus call his generation? The leaders of Jerusalem, of Judah of his day? This is a wicked and adulterous generation. Matthew 16, other passages as well. So here is Jesus identifying Jerusalem and Judah as the adulterous harlot bride. When the 10 northern tribes committed spiritual adultery and became the harlot, what did Yahweh do? He divorced her. He departed. He brought death on her. So here in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is speaking of Jerusalem and Judah having rejected the messengers, having rejected the invitation to the wedding, and that city, i.e. Jerusalem, the harlot bride, is now destroyed, divorced. We see the same thing in Matthew chapter 23 and 24 as Jesus depicts Jerusalem, and he says that it was Jerusalem that had killed the prophets all the way back. But he was going to bring destruction and death on them in that generation. And that's what Matthew chapter 24 is all about. Matthew 23 and 24 is thus about Old Covenant Jerusalem killing those sent to her to call them to the wedding, her refusal, her persecution of the prophets sent to her, and as a result, Jesus, the bridegroom, coming to her in judgment and destruction, divorcing her because she had committed spiritual adultery. That was the adulterous generation. She was the harlot bride. Now, some people try to delineate Matthew 24, 29 and following from Acts chapter 1. Well, is Acts chapter 1 the time, the second coming for the wedding? Yes, that's universally admitted. Okay, so Acts chapter 1 is the time of the second coming for the wedding. But the wedding would occur at the time of the divorcement of the adulterous harlot wife, when the Lord would send out his armies to destroy that adulterous harlot wife, Matthew 22, verse 7. Now, since the wedding would take place, according to Matthew chapter 22, verse 7, you see what happens in Matthew chapter 22. That city is destroyed. That harlot, adulterous wife is destroyed. And the master says to his servants, go out in the highways and the byways, gather anyone, bring them in, that my wedding banquet might be filled. The wedding is not delayed. The wedding wedding is not postponed. The wedding is not canceled. But when does it take place? At the destruction of the harlot bride, the old covenant city of Jerusalem. So you see, just like Hosea chapter 6 foretold that in the last days Judah would have her harvest, the same kind of harvest that, pardon me, that the 10 northern tribes had experienced. And what had the 10 northern tribes experienced? National destruction, the obliteration of the physical national kingdom of Israel. Yahweh said in the last days, Judah would experience that same kind of harvest. In Matthew 22, Yahweh is predicting, Jesus is predicting, that precise kind of harvest for Jerusalem and Judah at the time of the wedding. But the wedding cannot be the old covenant. The new covenant would be different. The new covenant would be with the righteous remnant. The new covenant would not be with the unfaithful, adulterous, harlot wife. No, it would be with the righteous remnant. Now remember, Amos 5, Hosea 6, Amos 9 said that wedding would take place in the day in which the remnant would be saved. I'm not going to develop this extensively. I'm just going to point out that Paul in Romans chapter 9 through 11 speaks undeniably of the fact that the righteous remnant of Old Covenant Israel was being saved even as he wrote. He cites Hosea. He cites Isaiah 10. Though the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, and as the stars of the heaven, yet only a remnant shall be saved. Paul said that was taking place in his ministry and in his day. Now watch this. The wedding under the new covenant, and when would the wedding take place? To consummate the new covenant? At the parousia. I will return to them. Hosea chapter 6. At the time of the resurrection, by the way. So here we have Paul citing Hosea's promise of the salvation of the remnant, which is the time of the wedding. We have Paul citing Isaiah concerning the salvation of the remnant in the last days, saying that was taking place in his day. And he says, citing Isaiah, that God would bring that work of the salvation of the remnant to its perfection. He would complete it in only a little while. Romans 9:28. Do you realize what that means? Do you realize what that says? Watch again. Yahweh had divorced Old Covenant Israel. He had departed from them. He had brought death on them, but he promised that he would remarry them in the last days. He would return to them. He would raise them from the dead. When? When he returned at the coming of the Lord in the day of the salvation of the remnant. Paul, in Romans 9 through 11, cites those very prophecies of the time of the salvation of the remnant, thus, the time of the wedding, thus, the coming of the Lord. Now watch what he does in Romans chapter 11, 25 through 27. He says, Brethren, I would not have you to be ignorant of this mystery, how blindness in part has happened unto Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel shall be saved. Now, is he talking about the totality of Israel? No. He's already said only a remnant would be saved. He has already said in Romans chapter 10 that the majority of Israel were unbelievers, as predicted and prophesied in the Old Covenant, but that the righteous remnant was responding to the gospel message. And he says, and thus all Israel, that's the remainder of the righteous remnant, shall be saved, as it is written. And he quotes Isaiah 27. He quotes Isaiah 59. And catch this, he quotes Jeremiah 31. And he says, as it is written, the Redeemer shall come out of Zion. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. Do you see what Paul's saying? Paul's saying the promised new covenant marriage would take place at the coming of the Lord. Wow. Okay, here is Paul saying that the promised new covenant, the new marriage covenant, which is the promise of the second coming of Christ of Acts chapter 1, would take place in fulfillment of Isaiah 27, 59, and Jeremiah 31. Now follow with me very, very closely. I can't spend a ton of time on this, but this is critical. But I've got some other material I want to bring in here momentarily. Paul said, all Israel, that's all the righteous remnant out of all 12 tribes, as he's begun to develop from chapter 9 into chapter 11. Because Paul has said he was himself part of the righteous remnant of Israel. Romans 11, 1 and following. Okay, now watch this. The salvation of the completion of the righteous remnant of Israel, that salvation of the righteous remnant, number one, would not be a long process, Hebrews 9:28. Number two, it would fulfill Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59. At the coming of the Lord to consummate the new marriage covenant promise of Jeremiah 31. Let's look very quickly at Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59. Isaiah 27, 10 and following, the Lord did promise to take away Israel's sin. But folks, the promise of Isaiah 27, 10 and following is astounding. It says that Yahweh would take away Israel's sin when, here's the key word, when he would destroy Jerusalem, turn the altar into chalk stone, when he would forget the people whom he created. And here's what's critical. He cites Deuteronomy 32:18, saying that it was Old Covenant Israel who was a people of no understanding. They were a people of no wisdom. But Deuteronomy 32:18 was a prophecy of what would happen to Israel in Israel's last days. Yahweh would call the Gentiles, Deuteronomy 32:20 and following. He would bring judgment on Israel in the last days because they were a people of no understanding, Deuteronomy 32:18. So here is Isaiah saying that Israel's salvation would come at the time in which Yahweh would forget the people he had created because they were a people of no understanding. And more specifically, it would be when he would destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And by the way, it would also be in the day in which Satan would be destroyed, Isaiah 27 verse 1. It would be in the day in which the Lord would come out of heaven to avenge the blood of the martyrs, Isaiah 26 verse 21. Now you got to follow me here. Isaiah 26 and 27 are the passages that Paul cites in Romans chapter 11 to predict the coming of the Lord for the wedding. The time of the new covenant promised in Jeremiah 31, which is the day of the remarriage of Israel to Yahweh at the coming of the Lord. Paul said that would be in fulfillment of Isaiah 26 and 27. That's the whole context of Isaiah 27. But the coming of the Lord of Isaiah chapter 26 and 27 would be at the time in which Yahweh would avenge the blood of the martyrs. Now let me ask you a question. When did Jesus say that all of the blood of all of the martyrs, all the way back to creation, would be avenged? Matthew 23. Jesus said, "Verily I say unto you, all of these things will come upon this generation." That was his generation. Do you see the power of that? Now remember, Acts chapter 1 is the coming of the Lord for the wedding, the coming of the bridegroom. But Romans chapter 11 is the coming of the bridegroom to consummate the new covenant marriage. The new covenant marriage coming of Romans 11 would be in fulfillment of Isaiah 26 and 27. But the coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel in Isaiah 26 and 27 would be at the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. Jesus said the coming of the Lord for the avenging of all of the blood of all of the martyrs all the way back to creation would be in his generation. That means that the coming of the Lord for the wedding, Romans chapter 11, the coming of the Lord of Acts 1, was to be in AD 70 in the judgment of Israel. Notice also Isaiah 59 that Paul also quotes right here in Romans chapter 11. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. Three times in Isaiah 59, Yahweh accused Israel of shedding innocent blood. You see, just like Isaiah 26:21. But in Isaiah 59, Yahweh said, I saw that there was no man, I saw that there was no intercessor, so I put on the garments of vengeance. And he said, I will repay, says the Lord, I will repay them according to their deeds. What are their deeds? Shedding innocent blood. When would that be? It would be in the day when I take away their sin. Now some people look at that, and by the way, in 2014, I had a formal moderated debate on YouTube with Dr. Michael Brown. Really an excellent scholar in many, many ways. We were talking about Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27. Whether or not it predicts a yet future coming of the Lord. He affirmed it does, and a conversion of Israel at the end of time. When I pointed out that Paul is citing Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59, both of which are judgment passages, Dr. Brown initially said, no, you've got it all wrong. That can't be right. Paul's talking about salvation. Isaiah 27 and 59 are talking about judgment. Well, I pointed out that both Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59 explicitly link the time of judgment with the time of salvation. It's undeniable. And incredibly, in a major admission, Dr. Brown admitted that was true. He had to retract his argument. Folks, you cannot separate in the Bible the time of salvation from the time of judgment. The coming of the Lord is invariably a time of salvation for the remnant, judgment on the wicked. So here, once again, in Romans chapter 11. Now remember, Romans 11 is the time of Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah 31 is the new marriage covenant. So Romans chapter 11 is the coming of the Lord to consummate the new marriage covenant. But Romans chapter 11, the coming of the Lord to consummate the new marriage covenant, would be in fulfillment of Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59 foretold the coming of the Lord in judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood. the coming of the Lord for shedding innocent blood was to be in AD 70, Matthew chapter 23. Therefore, the coming of the Lord for the wedding of Romans chapter 11 would be in AD 70. But wait, the coming of the Lord of Romans chapter 11 is the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 1. Therefore, the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 1 would be in AD 70. Folks, that's just as the old debaters used to say, this is just unget-overable. Unless a person can prove that the coming of the Lord in Romans chapter 11 is not to consummate the new wedding or new marriage covenant, and unless they can prove that Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59 would not be fulfilled at this covenant coming, and unless a person can divorce Matthew 23 from Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59, these connections are firm, inextricable, undeniable, and irrefutable. Now let's proceed just a little bit to show where the coming of the Lord in the rest of the New Testament, and we'll do this ever so briefly here. The coming of the Lord in the rest of the New Testament, and particularly the book of Revelation, is about the divorcement of Old Covenant Judah and the marriage of all 12 tribes. Revelation chapter 19, verses 1 through 6, is absolutely critical. In Revelation 18, we find the destruction of the city of Babylon, which according to chapter 19 is at the coming of the Lord. Babylon is destroyed. Why? Why? Well, she is destroyed because, number one, she's killed the prophets, Revelation chapter 16, verse 6. Number two, she is destroyed because she is spiritually called Sodom. And a very quick note here. According to Deuteronomy 32, 30 and following, in Israel's last days, she would become Sodom. Wow. And do you realize, in the Bible, the only city that is ever spiritually designated as Sodom was Old Covenant Jerusalem? Isaiah 1, Ezekiel 16, Ezekiel 23. So here we have, in the book of Revelation, this city Babylon called Sodom, and we have the Old Testament prediction that in the last days, in Israel's last days, she would become Sodom. But Revelation chapter 11 verse 8 also identifies this city as where the Lord was slain. Folks, is there any question whatsoever about this? Now watch this. Here in Revelation chapter 11, we find the destruction of the city where the Lord was slain. That's only Old Covenant Jerusalem. We thus have the divorcement, the destruction, and the death of the unfaithful, harlot, adulterous wife. Remember, in Revelation chapter 17, Babylon is called the harlot. In chapter 18, she's called the harlot. Remember, in the Bible, as Stephen Temple points out in his marvelous little book, Who is the Harlot Guilty of the Blood of All the Saints in Revelation? He points out in a marvelous way, and the book is available on my websites, eschatology.org or bibleprophecy.com. He proves absolutely irrefutably that in the Bible, the term harlot does not refer to just an immoral woman. It's a wife who has been in covenant with husband who becomes adulterous. Now ask yourself the question. At the time, or in the Bible, who was married to Israel? Who was in a covenant relationship with Yahweh? Wasn't the 10 northern tribes? She'd already been divorced. It was only Judah and Benjamin. Remember, Jesus called his generation this adulterous generation, speaking of Jerusalem and Judah. So now in Revelation, we find Babylon being called the harlot, guilty of adultery. Folks, only one city in the first century was still married to Yahweh, still married in a covenant relationship. This proves, by the way, that the Old Testament law had not passed away at the cross. Because you see, here is the bride, the old covenant bride, who has committed adultery. She's not being killed. The covenant is not being annulled until she's destroyed, until she has the same harvest that her older sister had suffered national destruction, never to rise again. Amos 5. So in Revelation chapter 11, we have the destruction of the city. In Revelation 17 to 19, we have the identity of that city as the city, by the way, of killing the apostles and prophets of Jesus. Chapter 18, 20 to 24. Who did Jesus identify as the city that would kill his apostles and prophets that he would send to them? Well, Luke 11, 49 and following. Behold, I send to you, Jerusalem, apostles, prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you shall kill. Luke 13, 30 and following. Not possible that a prophet perish outside of Jerusalem. Now, Jesus wasn't speaking of a strictly geographical venue. He was saying that it was Jerusalem that was the source of persecution. So when we come to Revelation chapter 18, 20 to 24, and it was Babylon that was killing the apostles and prophets, Jesus only identified one city as guilty of that. So back to Revelation chapter 19. In Revelation chapter 19, after describing, number one, who Babylon is, her destruction in chapter 18, we find the rejoicing at her destruction. And by the way, Revelation chapter 19, verse 2, the song of victory is, He, Yahweh, has avenged the blood of His saints. You know what that is? That's a direct citation of Deuteronomy 32:43. Now remember, Deuteronomy said, in Israel's last days. It's not about the end of time. It's not about the end of the Christian age. It is in Israel's last days, Yahweh would avenge the blood of the martyrs. Now what did we find in Isaiah 26 and Isaiah 59? In the last days, at the time of the salvation of Israel, at the time of the new covenant marriage, God would avenge the blood of the martyrs. So here at the destruction of Babylon, Yahweh fulfills Deuteronomy 32, which is about Israel and her last days, in the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. And watch this. At this destruction of Judah and Jerusalem, Revelation chapter 19, verse 6, let us be glad and rejoice, for the time of the wedding has come. And let us not forget what Hosea 6, 9 to 11 said, that Judah would have her harvest. What was her harvest? National kingdom destruction. That's what Revelation 17 to 19 is describing, the destruction of Babylon, the city where the Lord was slain. But Hosea said that that harvest would be when the remnant would be saved. In Revelation 7 and in Revelation 14, John said, I saw 144,000 out of all 12 tribes. Who are they? They're the righteous remnant of Israel. They're arrayed in white robes. Well, what are those white robes? It is the righteousness of the saints that John says in Revelation chapter 19, verse 6, the time of the wedding has come, and the bride has adorned herself with her righteous robes. You see the correlation? Now, here's the coming of the Lord in Revelation chapter 19 to destroy the adulterous harlot bride. The adulterous harlot bride can only be a bride that had been in covenant relationship with her husband. But now, due to her adultery, due to her unfaithfulness to the covenant, she is being destroyed. Judah is receiving her harvest of national destruction, just like Old Covenant 10 northern tribes had received her harvest of national destruction, never to rise again. But at this time of judgment, the righteous remnant, who had made their robes white through the blood of the Lamb, who had come by faith to righteousness, were now ready, all 12 tribes, to be married under the new covenant. And thus, Revelation chapter 19 is the coming of the Lord in judgment of Old Covenant Judah and Jerusalem, to divorce her, to destroy her, to put her to death. That is, to put the Old Covenant form to death and marry the new covenant. House of Israel, house of Judah. One bride, one new covenant. Well, Revelation chapter 19 is the coming of the Lord for the wedding. The coming of the Lord for the wedding in Revelation 19 is the coming of the Lord to destroy the old covenant bride Judah, to divorce her. The Lord came in judgment and destroyed Judah in AD 70. That means the coming of the Lord, the bridegroom, was in AD 70. Oh, but wait. The coming of the Lord as the bridegroom is the coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 1. The coming of the Lord of Acts chapter 1 is the coming of the Lord, the bridegroom of Revelation 19. The coming of the Lord, the bridegroom of Revelation 19 would be in judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem in AD 70. Therefore, the coming of the Lord, the bridegroom of Acts chapter 1 was in AD 70. You know, folks, once again, unless we can divorce, pun intended, unless we can divorce Acts chapter 1 from Jesus' identity as the bridegroom, unless we can divorce the coming of Acts chapter 1 from the coming of the Lord in divorcement of Judah and the time of the wedding of the righteous remnant, and unless we can divorce that coming from the time of judgment on Jerusalem, that unfaithful wife in AD 70, then this stands as absolutely prima facie proof that the coming of the Lord in Acts chapter 1 was fulfilled in AD 70. Now, as we proceed in our study, we will see that the language and the grammar of Acts chapter 1 is not on Jesus' physical appearance at all. It is on the glory that was manifested at that time. It is the glory of the bridegroom coming in his bridegroom splendor. No reference to physical appearance of a 5'5" Jewish man. I hope you'll look forward to that study as we proceed in our examination of Acts chapter 1.